You ready? Fantastic. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on Tuesday, the 18th of November for Scrutiny Panel 3, the meeting 3 of Scrutiny Panel number 2, Economy and Sustainability. We have had apologies from Councillor Dan Crawford and Councillor Sidhu for this evening, and just to make the panel aware that Councillor Padda is no longer a member of this Scrutiny panel. Item number 2, I don't believe we have any urgent matters arising. Number 3, I don't believe that there are any matters to be considered in private. Point number 4, do we have any declarations of interest? Any of the members of the panel? Fantastic. Number 5, agreement to the minutes. Are we all agreed that the minutes are a true and accurate record of the previous meeting? Thank you very much. Number 6, panel operations in 25-26, just to be noted. Do we note those? Fantastic. And then we move to point number 7, the main meat of the evening, our SIL and local plan discussion. Just to make the panel aware, I am very grateful to our witnesses this evening, in particular to Marilyn Smith, who has come from outside of the borough to speak to us, and Councillor Manro, the Cabinet member responsible for this topic. We're going to be looking at SIL, the Community Infrastructure Levy, first, and I think at that point I will hand over for a presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Yep, it's a pleasure to be invited to give this presentation to Scrutiny this evening. Just looking and sort of outlining where the council's position is on how we're looking to take forward SIL and how that sits with our developer contributions. Okay, so yeah, within this presentation, I did provide some more detailed reading in the background. I've truncated this presentation to keep it shorter. I'm just going to quickly outline the 2 different types of developer contributions that we have. So the council is currently operating Section 106 contributions, and it has been doing so for over 20 years now successfully. And we're looking to adopt the Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL, within 2026, with a paper going to full cabinet in, I think it's on the 16th of December, full council, apologies. So just quickly outlining what Section 106 developer contributions are. They're often known also as planning obligations. They're a financial contribution that's negotiated by our planners, and that's part of the planning application process. So this comes at the front end before planning decisions are made. These contributions are secured in a legal agreement under different obligations, and that's attached to planning permission. And the contributions can only pay for mitigation of specific demonstrated and justified impacts of development, usually where it can be demonstrated that SIL wouldn't adequately fund them. So looking at SIL, the other option for developer contributions, there was a Planning Act in 2008 that established the right to implement SIL, and once SIL is implemented, it's controlled by the Infrastructure Levy regulations. It essentially works as a tax that's levied on development, which is paid when construction works commence. It's a really important tool to fund delivery of infrastructure that's needed to support development and good growth in the borough and the local plan aspirations. Ealing is currently an outlier in that it's the only London borough that doesn't currently operate SIL and Section 106, as all the other boroughs have now operated it for many years. I think the last one probably was adopted in around about 2021. The OPDC, which obviously includes a large slice of Ealing, now does collect its own SIL since it adopted its charging schedule in February 2024. It is true that SIL will replace Section 106 contributions to a significant extent, but it won't totally replace them. The 2 will operate in tandem if they're brought in. And Ealing will be a collecting authority for both Mayor's SIL, MSIL, and also Ealing SIL separately. And Ealing has been collecting Mayor's SIL since 2012 when it was brought in. It passes this money to TfL, and we use that to fund repaying the cost of delivering the Elizabeth line. So Ealing does benefit quite a lot from that. So in terms of looking at the differences, or just summarising the differences between SIL and Section 106, Section 106 has to be negotiated with developers, and it's usually or most often viability tested, whereas SIL is a fixed non-negotiable charge that's based on the floor space and development. In many instances, SIL payments will replace Section 106, as I've said, but they will continue to be operated in tandem with Section 106 if SIL is adopted. Section 106 is still required to cover the costs of the costs of site-specific mitigations required to make development acceptable in planning terms. That's mostly going to be for our larger sites. Affordable housing, where they make payments in lieu and don't do on-site delivery, and carbon offset fund payments are always going to be Section 106 due to their nature. One advantage for the council of SIL is SIL has to be paid earlier, usually on commencement, whereas usually developers try to negotiate that payments of Section 106 will be later, often on occupation, although SIL for large schemes in order to help developers can be paid in instalments. So they pay one instalment after 60 days after commencement and one 240 days after. So the next slide just sets out what the current proposals are for the Ealing SIL charging schedule. And this is what's been through the independent examiner's assessment and passed with flying colours and is now ready to be taken forward for adoption by the council. There are two zones proposed for residential with different rates. So we've got a central Ealing zone rate. I'll just show you where that is on the next slide. And then we've got an outside of the central Ealing zone rate. So within the central Ealing zone rate, the proposed residential charge is twice that of outside, so £300 per square metre within central Ealing and 150 outside. We've then got quite substantial charges for student housing and purpose-built shared living, £350 per square metre. We have data centres, £150, hotel £50, and industrial £40. And then the council decided not to seek to charge any money for office, affordable workspace, retail, food and beverage, healthcare, education, or community uses, as it wants to encourage these uses, or it wouldn't be viable for them to pay SIL. As noted before, the OPDC has a separate charging schedule and collects within its own area. So how were the SIL rates tested and were they set? So the SIL rates have been subject to expert viability testing. The local plan viability assessment, which was undertaken by BNP Paribas, has informed the SIL charging rates. The LPVA tests the impact of the proposed SIL rates on a wide variety of different types of development scenarios, and to ensure that they wouldn't negatively impact on the delivery of development or levels of affordable housing delivered, and that they would deliver close to the maximum reasonable amount of contribution from developers. So where are we in terms of implementing Ealing SIL? So the SIL charging schedule has now passed through the examination in public, and we have the final letter from the inspector. The next step is for the SIL charging schedule to be recommended to full council, and that's planned for the 16th of December. Provided that that's implemented, provided that that's approved by full council, once the SIL has been implemented, all development granted planning permission after this date will be SIL chargeable development, but any development that's given planning permission before the implementation date will not be charged any SIL. Currently, the proposed implementation date is the 1st of March 2026. The reason for the lag between the 16th of December and the 1st of March 2026 is to provide sufficient time. It's like a balancing act to provide sufficient time for developers to be notified that SIL is being brought in by the council, and for the development management team to be able to clear all of the current applications which it's holding, so as that developers can't be unhappy that they would be unfairly charged SIL that they weren't anticipating. So, but obviously we want to bring in SIL as early as possible, so that's the date we consider it to be an appropriate date that it would be brought in. So in terms of how do we charge SIL, who's exempt? So most development which creates a net additional floor space of 100 square meters or a new dwelling of any size is potentially SIL liable. That's based on the land uses as set out in the SIL charging schedule. in terms of it being a net floor space where you've got existing buildings on site, if those buildings have not been left vacant and have been in use, there is a test to prove that. And if it passes that test, then that floor space can be discounted from any new development which is being brought forward. So that existing floor space is discounted from the gross additional floor space that's been added to the site, to the development. So there are 4 main exemptions and reliefs. So not everybody has to pay SIL, and quite correctly so. So affordable housing, the percentage of a development that's brought forward as affordable housing, that floor space is discounted and is not charged SIL. Where you've got small residential annexes and extensions to people's homes, correctly, those people are also not charged SIL. And where people are building their own houses or flats, and it can be a communal group of people building together as houses, provided that they meet certain criteria, those people will also not be charged SIL. And development by registered charities is also usually SIL exempt. There are some strict guidance and regulations and rules for people applying for these exemptions and reliefs to follow, but provided that they're followed, then these reliefs and exemptions should be forthcoming. So what triggers SIL liability and when's it paid? So SIL becomes paid, or due to be paid, sorry, on commencement of development. There's usually a bit of a lag because developments which have full planning permission have up to 3 years to start that development. And often the development won't actually commence until close to that 3 years after the permission. So the SIL is often not due until up to 3 years after the permission is granted. And this is even longer for larger developments or developments with phasing and those with outline planning. This can often be up to 5 or 10 years, as it takes a long time to build out these schemes or start the different phases, which are also different individual SIL chargeable developments themselves. So there's going to be a lag between when we implement SIL and when we start to receive significant amounts of SIL. As you may have heard, the government has recently, the government and the mayor have recently released a joint paper setting out some measures to try and stimulate increased house building in London. Further consultations on these measures is due this month, and no changes can be implemented until the formal consultation is completed, and they would also require changes in secondary legislation to make any changes to SIL. So the proposed measures that have been tabled include a temporary 50% relief from SIL for house builders that have qualifying schemes. So these qualifying schemes would commit to deliver at least 20% affordable housing. There is potentially a higher but not yet specified reduction of SIL above the 50% relief for those schemes that would deliver 20% affordable housing, but that's not yet been provided, the details of that. If the proposed SIL relief is implemented, this would obviously have an impact on the SIL receipts which Ealing would receive, and work is still ongoing to try and understand exactly what this impact might look like. It's noted that SIL typically only accounts for a few percent of overall development costs, and there are concerns from many local authorities that the proposed SIL relief would be unlikely to actually make much of a difference in terms of stimulating increased levels of house building, but it would quite possibly significantly reduce funding for infrastructure. So the difficult question, how much SIL are we actually forecasting? So due to the lag between the grant of planning permission and paying SIL, it's expected that the SIL receipts will staircase up. In the first year, the council is unlikely to receive a large amount of SIL, possibly 20%, raising to potentially 40% in year 2, and then hopefully to close to 100% average SIL rates by the end of year 3, year 4. Looking at sort of very high level data that we have from the housing trajectory figures from the local plan, and doing pretty crude calculations, it looks like the council may receive around about £5 million a year in SIL, taking account of the 50% relief. It looks like it would be possibly 6 million or something in the region of that if this measure isn't taken forwards. But I have to say that accurate forecasting of future SIL receipts is very difficult, particularly at the position the council's in now, where we don't have any granted planning permissions with SIL on them. The figures provided are the best we believe we can provide at this current time. Once SIL has been implemented, we'll have a pipeline of chargeable developments of planning permissions that are in SIL, and also pre-apps where we can calculate what the SIL would be, and that will allow us to do much more accurate forecasting. And together with discussing with developers about their forecasting for their scheduling for the delivery of their developments, we'll be able to have a much better and more accurate picture of the SIL which will be coming in future years. And it's necessary to note that the figures that we provide in the SIL forecast could go up or down in either direction quite significantly, and they should only be used as an indicative figure. So yeah, this slide just shows the top table shows what it was forecasting about a year ago, with the first year being about 1.2 million and raising up to 6 million after 3 to 4 years. And then the bottom table suggests where we think, looking at the percent, if the 50% reduction is implemented, where we might sit. Actually, I was surprised that when doing the calculations, the figures didn't drop off as much, because not every scheme is affected as far as using the information that we've got as by the 50% reduction. So the figures, yeah, they were not reduced by as much as I was concerned they might have been. So I think potentially we still have the chance, if we implement SIL, to bring in a good amount of SIL to deliver infrastructure in the borough.
It's come in. So we will still be getting 106 payments. So the schemes that have gone through the system, and since 2022, I think we've raised £47 million in 106 payments. So some of those will drop away, because the SIL will take some of that, but there will still be 106 coming in terms of mitigation for schemes. So it's not as if developers haven't paid. We've been collecting, from 22 onwards, we've collected £47 million in 106 payments. So it's still close to 8-10 million a year. And we've got those schemes which have not yet finished yet coming forward. I mean, there's a couple, one in Southall, one in West Ealing, that will deliver us 15 million. And they're already started to build. So there are lots more 106 payments to come in as we put SIL in. So it's not as if revenue's not coming in, it's just it'll be a different type of revenue which we can allocate with our delivery infrastructure plan. So SIL enables us to gather together lots of small pots of money we get from small developments throughout the borough, and then allocate it to our key priorities in terms of infrastructure. That's the benefit of SIL, and that's why we wanted to bring it in.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. No, thank you for clarifying, Councillor Manuel. I think that was a useful point there. So yeah, just sort of explaining what we can do with the SIL, basically. What can it be spent on, and how does it break down? So there are 3 different pots of SIL. There's strategic SIL, there's neighbourhood SIL, and there's the SIL admin fund. So the figures I've shown here are indicative. These are not like the final figures necessarily. So strategic SIL is normally around about 80%, and neighbourhood SIL is set at a maximum of 15% outside of neighbourhood plan areas, and can raise up to 25% in neighbourhood plan areas. But the SIL regulations do not compel the council to operate any neighbourhood SIL. There's not a minimum level, there are maximum levels. But the council is very keen to implement neighbourhood SIL. So I'm positive that 100% it will be implementing neighbourhood SIL, but the amount has not been fully confirmed to this date. But looking at what other boroughs do, often it would be 15% either across the whole borough, or it will be 15% with 25% in neighbourhood plan areas, depending on how that works out and how that would meet governance requirements in terms of connected communities, your town, your voice, and the 7 towns aspirations. And then we have the SIL admin fund that makes up the last of the pie, which can be up to 5%, and that covers the costs of essentially my team, who would manage the administration of SIL and our IT systems, which are used to do so. So what can strategic SIL be spent on? So strategic SIL, the main part of SIL, has to be spent on physical infrastructure required to support the development of the borough. So this should really be being spent on things which are supporting the aims of the local plan. But it can cover the full spectrum of infrastructure, as highlighted in the bullet points here: transport, schools, health, parks, flood defences, community facilities, etc. And just to outline what strategic SIL cannot be spent on. So it can't be spent on the provision of services or employment of people. It can't be used to fund construction or bulk purchase of affordable housing. And it can't be used on any project which isn't directly related to the provision of new or improved physical infrastructure. So what can neighbourhood SIL be spent on? So this is a much more flexible pot of money. As I explained, it can be somewhere between 15 and 25% of SIL receipt. It can be spent on anything that's required to support development in an area, and it can include funding services, events, and people. It can be spent borough-wide, or it can be spent on a more local town basis. And Ealing's currently working to establish the end SIL allocation and governance processes, which will need to be approved by Cabinet in 2026. The NSIL process will be aligned with the 7 towns, the Your Voice, Your Town, and the Connected Communities programmes, and the allocation will be based on work which goes on with those programmes. So the Infrastructure Delivery Plan, or the IDP, is the key document policy document we use for infrastructure planning in Ealing, and it's key evidence base in the new local plan or the emerging new local plan and the SIL charging schedule. It lists and costs all of the planned and needed infrastructure projects in the borough, and it demonstrates the infrastructure funding gap. So that's the gap between all known funding sources for infrastructure and the anticipated costs of delivering the items of infrastructure that are required. The current IDP is published in 2024, and we're currently planning to start work on a new one in 2026. So the reason for the IDP being particularly important is it leads into the next point. How do we prioritise strategic SIL funding, which is obviously a very important question. So the governance process for the prioritisation of strategic SIL is still being agreed, and it will need to be approved by Cabinet in 2026. Looking at how other boroughs do this and how we believe we will do this, it's anticipated that the projects that will be prioritised for strategic SIL funding will be derived from the project list in the IDP, because those are those are currently, or should be, all of the projects that we know of in the borough that need to be delivered. So that should be our comprehensive list. The existing IDP does a good job of that, but we believe it can be strengthened. So that's why we want to work to deliver a new IDP in 2026 to make sure that all projects are picked up and are available for SIL funding. Okay, thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Maybe rolling back slightly to the start of the presentation, we were talking about the SIL, the rates at which SIL was set. Talked about kind of it being limited as how high you can set it. Can a rate be set lower in order to further political priorities in terms of encouraging certain sorts of development, or is it a purely kind of BNP Paribas kind of say, this is we've been told we have to find you the highest number we can get without impacting the number of developments? So, and can you also choose to set it high to discourage certain sorts of development as well?
Yeah, I'd let Councillor.
So, partly the reason why co-living and students have been set at a higher level is we wanted to bring the viability of residential C3 accommodation becoming more viable, because during this last 2 or 3 years, all we were seeing is applications coming in for co-living and student, PBSA, whatever they call it, student accommodation, and that those were the only ones that seemed to be viable in this economic climate. And C3 residential, we had 1 year, I think, where we had not had a single major application for residential. So some of that started to change now, but that was one of the rationales where we are charging a higher amount for students and co-living to make C3 more viable and people build standard residential accommodation with affordable accommodation, because that's what we really need, and we don't want to have a glut of co-living and student coming into the borough. So yes, we do have a choice, and other boroughs would have other priorities.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, is that a published priority? Do we talk about that anywhere? Is that in the council plan, or is that a sort of an internally decided one that, where was the inspiration for where it was set? Where was it lifted from?
Yeah, so the upper levels that you suggested are set out by the BNP report. In terms of how it's exactly decided which levels we go at, more often than not, we're looking at which types of development we want to stimulate and which ones we want to calm down a little bit and direct towards those where we want to stimulate them, essentially. Majority of the rates that have been set out in the charging schedule, I believe, are at or close to what BNP would have recommended. Is they've obviously set a buffer where you don't want to go into because you don't want to impact development viability. In terms of actual deciding the rates, that might be outside of my knowledge. I think that I arrived at the time. I've been at the council for 1 year, so I've arrived at the time when most of this was crystallised. So I don't know whether my colleagues here would be able to advise if you've got any knowledge on that.
Just to add, if I may, Steve Barton, yes, that's right. I mean, obviously, the viability assessment was looking at both the local plan and the draft still charging schedule. So we were doing that simultaneously, to save a bit of money, but also because it makes sense when you're looking at a local plan to establish what your priorities are and how you're going to pay for them. And obviously the SIL is a key component of that. So obviously we were exploring a whole range of different options as part of the local plan. You'll remember we went through 2 rounds of public consultation looking at that. And Councillor Manroe has been, I think, very eloquent in explaining the issues, particularly around students and co-living. I have to say that wasn't always the case, because I can remember our current adopted plan we went through examination when there were no student accommodation being provided in West London fairly generally, but particularly in Ealing. And we were at that stage encouraging through policy the attraction of student accommodation to the borough. And I think Councillor Manroe's explained, we now feel that's become overheated. And we obviously want to ensure that we have, balanced communities, mixed types of uses, and we were also trying to prioritise residential accommodation. Another example was in relation to data centres. And I have to say our position on this has sometimes been a bit schizophrenic, I have to say. But there was a belief that data centres are very poor when it comes to job density, which is obviously a key plank of the emerging local plan and indeed the council's plan in terms of job generation, and of course also has other impacts, particularly in terms of electricity generation and on water supply. And of course that can and has had an impact on other types of developments. We were at one stage looking to set higher rates for data centres, and we did trial those as part of the examination. I have to say we were less successful in getting those through the examination process, and we were knocked back on a proposal to set a higher rate on data centres. So there's an element of art as well as science to this, because clearly, obviously, overtly you're not supposed to be using SIL as a policy mechanism in an upfront, overt way. You've got to be a bit more subtle, a bit more clever in terms of how you set the rates. And I think we've got it right in terms of students and co-living. We were supported on that, and data centres we possibly flew our kite a bit too high.
Sorry, I know I keep going, but sorry, that's a slightly different answer, I think, to the first bit of that answer. So SIL is not supposed to be a policy mechanism to discourage or encourage certain sorts of development.
It is and it isn't. That's what I'm trying to say. I think the word I used was overt. If you're a bit too obvious about it, you're going to be challenged, and we were challenged at the examination, particularly on data centres, because we were obviously trying to push the argument really to the margins in terms of viability, and the inspector, I'm afraid, wasn't convinced by our evidence or our arguments, and we got knocked back. Even though we argued on the basis of the viability evidence, it was within the range of possibilities that our viability consultant had set, but the inspector was more persuaded by the arguments put forward by some of the development industry in that regard. Although weren't persuaded by Luxgrove and other co-living product merchants, and sided with the council. So,
thank you very much, Councillor Gallant.
Well, thanks, Chair. Should I do them all at once, or
let's run through a few?
No, very easy. Well, not so easy. Thank you, and thank you very much for coming. By the way, I have to say, we're very grateful, and publicly be very grateful too for you coming and answering the questions tonight. Can I just say why SIL was so late coming to Ealing? Was that a conscious decision? I mean, why was it so far behind the other boroughs? The other question is the IDP. Is it not a yearly publication? I'm not quite sure of the timetable for that publication. Question also about the 50% relief, because what I understood, it was a 50% relief, and then I understood from your presentation it's 100% relief. So I'm not quite sure what the relief is for those projects that are affordable housing or charitable operations and so on. Does brownfield Greenbelt, does that come into the picture as well for relief? I mean, building on brownfield, is that a factor as well? And that's about enough for now. Thank you.
So it's a very good question. The first question in terms of why we are the last local planning authority in London to introduce SIL. I should say from a personal professional perspective, it's not through one to trying, because of course we did go through a SIL examination inquiry some years ago, and we passed with flying colours again. But at the point when we were looking to then adopt and implement, the decision was then taken by the then council, largely influenced by my then boss, who was the sort of chief of sort of planning and economic development, that he wasn't entirely persuaded by the economics around SIL. So, as has already been highlighted, one of the big benefits of SIL is it's transparent, it's easy to operate. The belief then was that Section 106, which we have, as it's been highlighted, done very well over recent years. Obviously, the art of the negotiation often meant that you could possibly push negotiations a little bit further and try and get more money from developers, because ultimately SIL, in simple terms, is a sort of, and indeed Section 106 is effectively a sort of tax on development, must meet certain types of criteria and all the rest of it. But the major difference, and I think this was the major and uppermost concern, was around the impact on affordable housing. And so the policy imperative, even more so then as it is now, was very much delivering as much affordable housing, and the feeling was that we would do better on that basis. It wasn't necessarily a view I shared at the time, but that was the view that prevailed, and so we decided not to implement SIL at the time.
Thank you. I'll take the IDP question next, if that's okay. So there is the infrastructure delivery plan, the IDP. There's also the infrastructure funding statement, which are the IFS. So those are produced annually. The council has a statutory duty. We're a bit slow in producing those. That's something I've kicked into gear since I've been at the council. We published last year's one on time for the first year, and I've since retrospectively recently published the previous 4 before that. Now are all available online. So we are now in line with what we should have been, what should be published. And the next one will be every year. Looking back, you have to publish one by the 31st of December for the previous year that ended in 31st of March in that year. So we're just putting the final touches to the 24-25 IFS, which will be online at some point during December, available. So yeah, that's the distinction between. But it's a very good point about the IDP. Whilst the IDP doesn't have to be produced every year, I think it should be. I want to move to a live IDP where we're constantly looking at what new projects are evolving and what needs are evolving and what projects would fall out of that and how we have a document that meets that need. So the IDP and the IFS will want to talk to each other going forward. So this is something which I'm looking to implement in the coming years. And then looking at the SIL reliefs. So sorry, I can see where the confusion has arisen here. So affordable housing under the current SIL regime, affordable housing, if you have a scheme, say 50% of it was affordable housing and 50% was private market sale, you wouldn't pay any SIL on the 50% affordable, you just pay on the market sale. What the government's proposal is now will be that you'll get 50% off of what you would have been paying. So it's a further reduction on top of what was currently reduced. So it's like a double reduction basically. So I think there was another question before the IDP, but I can't remember.
Yes, I mean, just a bit of my sort of reading on it. Was there? Does brownfield? Does the actual location come into it? Brownfield, site building on brownfield, or building on grey belts or whatever. Is that a factor?
There's been various things mooted, but off the top of my head, I don't think there's anything concrete about that.
Okay.
I've seen. Steve, I'll just check with you.
I think the devil will be in the detail, because obviously we're going to see the more detailed proposals and there will be a consultation on that. So I think it'd be wrong to speculate at the moment. I doubt that distinction will be made, but I think I'd reserve my position until we know.
Okay, thanks.
And that information is due, the government consultation is due by the end of this month, and it's a 6-week consultation.
Councillor Ninter.
Thank you, Chair. Pardon me if I end up barking up the wrong tree, but thank you very much for this briefing. And I think there are a number of benefits of the scheme in terms of moving away from Section 106 to CIL. I think the benefits are both for the developer as well as the council, because we won't have to invest a lot of time in negotiation, where sometimes the big developers who could employ better negotiators end up paying less, and the small ones ended up paying more. And second benefit is we know how much money is coming in, and it will be paid up front, when the bidding starts. However, I have certain questions. First question, I think Council Gallant asked. The government might give CII discount up to 50% on 20% of affordable housing. How much money we are likely to lose as a result of that? And the second question is, the charging map? It showed centrally zone, where we will be charging £300 instead of £150. How do you draw the red line, and how is it fair that the two identical sites will be paying two different lots of money? And the third question is, the cover of the report says fighting inequality in big letters, but I can't see any money being allocated to the poorest parts of the borough like Southall. My ward has been the most deprived ward for years, and there's no money ring-fenced for that. Is fighting inequality just a corporate speak, dare I say, or is there any money being ring-fenced towards it?
So the 20% affordable, all affordable buildings doesn't get sale charged. So in any development, whatever is affordable, there's zero sale charged on that floor space. Whatever this floor space taken by affordable housing, no sale is payable. On the bit that's left, which is private, at the moment we have two sets, one central Ealing, and it's usually based on what people can sell that floor space at pounds per square foot or pounds per square meter. So in central Ealing, you could sell a flat at 1,000 at one point. I know it's come down, but you could sell it at £1,000 a square foot. Whereas in Southall or in Greenford, you'd be lucky to sell it at £450 per square foot. So developers on the same space would make more profit. So that's why the sale is in two bands. So in the more expensive areas where if they build a flat, they can charge a lot more, 1.2 million, 1.5 million for a flat with the same floor space as say one in Greenford or in Southall. Their scheme can afford to pay us more in terms of sale. So that's why there's two separate zones. It's based on the sales value per square foot of the units or homes that would be built. So we're trying to get the maximum. In terms of 106 was, as the officer indicated, the mitigation is set around that one single development. You can't use that money for other uses. Whereas with SIL, we have an infrastructure delivery plan, which can be any project anywhere in the borough, and the money would be gathered together. And if it was number one on the list, it would get done first, whether it's in Southall or Greenford or Hanwell, wherever. So our infrastructure delivery plan doesn't distinguish between where it is in the borough. Whatever seal we get in to the seal, we will use that money to knock off each one of the projects. And if there's one project in your ward and it was number one or number two, it would get done very quickly. And all the money that was gathered in the borough would be used to do that. So that's why seal is so important. Whereas if you did a project in Greenford and you got £5 million of 106 mitigation and the rest of it, you could only spend it in that area. You couldn't spend that money anywhere else. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Those 106 payments are linked to that development. And if we were to spend it somewhere else, if the developer found out, they can ask for that money back, right? And if you don't spend it for what you've negotiated in a 106, they're able to come back to the council and say, you haven't done this, we paid you to do this, we want our money back, and we'd be obliged to give that money back. So that's why 106 is not the tool we think, it's helped us in terms of affordable housing, because we've managed to negotiate high levels of affordable housing through 106, but it hasn't helped us with our infrastructure delivery. Sorry, you want to add?
Just to illustrate the point, if you think about why Section 106 came in, essentially, without the 106 payment, your officers or planning committee should refuse the planning application, because the adverse impacts of that development will be so great that you shouldn't proceed with that scheme. The Section 106 provides mitigation for any adverse impacts or harms, depending on the factor that we're considering, to mitigate the adverse impacts of that development. So if the development is in Greenford, then the money needs to be spent to mitigate the adverse impacts of that development in Greenford. It can't be spent in Acton or Southwold or Northolt. And so I remember when we had the local plan discussion, when we were talking about emerging priorities on infrastructure, helping to shape the things that went into the evidence base and the IDP, for example, Northolt councillors complained that they saw very little Section 106 receipts, and that's frankly because there was very little development activity taking place there. If you look in the current adopted plan, there are no development sites, no site allocations in Northolt. So without development, there was no Section 106 receipts, therefore there was no pot of money. So the advantage of SIL is you don't have that geographical restriction. You have the ability to be able to spend the money subject to your own council spending priorities anywhere in the borough, provided they meet certain criteria. So you're not restricted geographically to where you spend the money.
Can I just add to that as well? Also, with the ability to spend money as NSIL and neighbourhood SIL, that 15% which would be in Southwold. My understanding is that all the 7 towns would get a fair section of that pot, and then the town communities which are set up within the Your Voice, Your Town and the Connected Communities environment would prioritise that spending. So whilst it's not the main strategic SIL pot, and that's very important, it is another funding mechanism that should bring money equally and fairly to all of the 7 towns.
Councillor Mohan?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. How do other local authorities allocate SIL? Do they operate a bid system? Is spend allocated annually and included in capital program? And the second question is, where is it possible to find further details on 106 allocation and spend?
Okay, I'll take the second question, but explain how they do things in Barking and Dagenham.
Thank you for having me at the meeting tonight. So as well as head of planning, I work with allocating all the SIL and the 106 in the borough. We've had SIL since 2015. We've done 3 main rounds of allocation, but whilst we've been doing through the process, after the first 2 rounds, we looked at how we did it again, and then we've changed our governance process so it fits a bit more with the experience we'd had. So if I could just say, so 27, we collected for a couple of years, and then we set out a policy in 2017 through Cabinet, and that was to do bids, ask people to bid, and then it would go through a panel, which was member-led. And so the very first time was just officers, and there were 3 bids, and they were mainly to parks and children's play space. And then we brought in the policy that you can bid for it. So then lots of bids came in from the community and from council departments. And I think we ended up having 18 bids, which substantially outweighed the amount of available funding that we had in the SIL pot. So we had to make judgments on these 18 bids as to which ones could get funding and which ones couldn't. So we had to judge in terms of member priorities, how deliverable they were, whether it was kind of a bit of a pie in the eye scheme or whether they'd really costed it out properly and they had people, good project manager who could do it. So in the end, we went through Cabinet and we had 9 projects, and they varied from £600,000 to a new jetty to get the Uber Clipper, Thames Clipper, to come to the new housing developments in Barking. So there's a transport infrastructure one. Setting up a women's museum, we negotiated a community space under a 106. So we gave a women's museum 250,000 to fit it out so we could have that as a cultural thing in Barking. We had a community hall, which had a £3 million project to do redevelopments of the community hall. It got, I think, about 2 million off the mayor, loads of funding, and it just needed 300,000 to top it off. So we just finished it off so they could get on and do it. So there was lots of different ones. There were a couple of down ones where smaller community organisations kind of struggled. What we'd said was, we'll give you money on, 10,000 to start and then 50,000 halfway through. And that kind of model didn't work, we found, because the smaller organisations, one did very well, spent it out, perfect. Another one struggled a bit. They went out to tender and they'd bid for 300,000 and the tender came back at 1.2 million when their spec was actually funded up. So after that round, and that one's actually still going, it was allocated in 2019, nearly finished with it, but it's had subsequent allocations to keep going. So we learned then. So then when it was the next time, we then said, right, we've got to be a lot tighter here. We don't give money away. We say, right, let's see your project. As your project moves on, we will then pay the bills, or it'll be a council project and it'll be coded through the council. But so we learned that way there wasn't great governance over it. It was very difficult because smaller groups aren't used to handling such large sums of money. So we changed the governance process to make it a lot more straightforward based on the experience we had. So now it's still on bids, but rather than being one annual round of bids, we have a process of regular meetings with TfL, with the NHS as infrastructure providers, with all the council services and with our finance to find out how much we've got, and service directors. So we're aware and all the way through saying who's got bids, what's happening, so you can be a lot more flexible. So when something comes up, you can address it, and it has to go through an officer panel and then a director level assets board, and then it goes through a members review group, just in case for the political priorities, and then it can either be delegated if it's less than 200,000, over 200,000 goes to cabinet. So we're a lot more flexible to things that happen. We have had a couple of emergency bids, which are done under Chief Exec's authority when you've got major schemes which have suddenly gone bust. So that has happened. But again, we've tightened up the process so it shouldn't happen because we're more flexible in giving out the money throughout the year. Our latest round, which is going to cabinet in a couple of weeks, we'll pretty much clean out the pot. We've got some really good bids again. Majority of them councillor ones. They are now supporting a lot of capital programme. We haven't got capital, so yeah, it's not very sexy, but repairing park bridges is going to get funding, so to systematically do them. But also we've got an enclosure for reintroducing European stork, which is being funded like London Wildlife Trust, but they want SIL to do the enclosure for it. A couple of parks pavilions which have been derelict, and we're putting funding with things like the English Cricket Board to repair them, open them back up to the community, and then have community groups take them over as community assets. I think so there's other, so like for council officers, one who works in the community team as community hubs, he's put forward community facilities that we're handing over to the community. Some need repairs, like they need heating repairs, lighting, one needs new boilers, so putting the money towards that, and then that saves the council money in the end, because you can then generate rental income, which you haven't been able to do at the moment. So we're quite flexible. Unfortunately, our IDP isn't up to date. But what we've found is when we did have IDP, if we don't collect enough SIL, we're not like Westminster who've got millions, we're Barking. It's quite low numbers. So if someone says we want a brand new health centre, we haven't got enough money. We'll never have it. It'll take us 10 years to get enough SIL to do that. So what we've learned is we can do like a few 100,000 to help projects along, but we're trying to get projects to match fund and do things to help themselves as well, and try and get other sorts of funding. Sometimes we've got one grade 2 listed building, Valence Museum, and we've got Heritage Lottery funding, Arts Council, but the council have to put in their own funding. Again, we've got no capital, so we're holding the SIL funding against it to show that we can put some funding in. Whether that will ever be spent or we can use the other funding to get all the works done is another matter, but that's another way of using it. Football Foundation, we did a big football project. FA said you've got to have match funding, so you can use the SIL to hold it against match funding to bring extra funding into the borough. So there are lots and lots of ways you can use it depending on how much you go, but it's the flexibility. That's why it's such a good asset for the council to have.
I think Councillor Mohan wanted to follow up on.
Thank you very much for a very detailed reply. What sort of efforts did you put in place to kind of sell SIL to residents? How did you advertise it? How did you encourage residents?
That's probably more on the NSIL bit, the neighbourhood SIL. That's managed by our policy and participation team who deal with all the community groups. So they know the community groups. They've set up residents panels. So they get residents to put themselves forward in almost like a Dragon's Den type panel of residents. They get training to do that so they feel empowered. And then I think twice a year, they have the bids come in and the panel sit, and I think they have about 3 panels throughout the borough. And then they assess their other residents' proposals. They started off at £10,000 maximum bid. It's just gone to Cabinet to raise that to 15,000. So they're much smaller community projects, or they could be used to put on community events. And that's borough-wide. It's not split up as it has to be one per ward, but it does turn out that it generally is completely borough-wide, but it's the residents who run it. And the council just kind of manage the admin processes, but the power of allocation is given to residents. But that's the neighbourhood SIL, the 15%.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Negpal.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a fantastic presentation, and I love that Dragon's Den concept. Amazing. So I've got a few questions, Chair, if that's okay. Great. Okay. So can you talk to us about what the practical next steps are between now and implementation? And forgive me if I didn't understand correctly. You said that it will go to full council on the 16th of December, but we won't implement until the 16th of March. Is that to clear out applications that are already in? And are we expecting an influx of applications given that there's now this anticipation that SIL will be implemented? You also mentioned that to developers, SIL is actually negligible in terms of their overall costs. So will this actually encourage building affordable housing, and to what extent, if the answer to that is yes? And are we learning from other authorities, having heard what Marilyn's just said about having better governance when we implement SIL? So thank you.
Okay, in terms of next steps, as has been outlined, the plan is to take it to full council, the SIL charging schedule, to request their approval to implement it, and with the date of implementation to be the 1st of March 2026. And yes, that's to try to clear out the planning applications that we've got on our books now currently that have been received, so as to be fair to planning applicants and to preserve the council's reputation. We don't want, we want to be seen to be fair, but at the same time we want to get SIL in as soon as possible and start bringing in good money to spend on delivering infrastructure. So we think that the 1st of March strikes the correct balance for that, and that seems to be an appropriate date. Allows us to do appropriate comms and advise applicants and developers that SIL is coming, and make sure that they're fully aware through the council's website, through putting tags on the end of our emails, and just through our developers forums. But most developers are from managing the SIL inbox. Most or many developers, I'd say, that are regulars within our borough are aware that we're implementing through, and many have given representations. We've responded to them. So I think, the idea that SIL is coming is a known fact in Ealing. It's just the exact days. So yeah, provided that we can get approval from full council to implement on the 1st of March, I think that should leave us without too many problems. In terms of, sorry, the second question was
SIL being a negligible cost to
sure. So
housing.
So having looked at so Dr. Anthony Lee from BNP Paribas is the key leading sort of light in London on viability, and he's usually called to provide viability assessments for all of the different councils' SIL adoption and sitting through the examinations. And something he's pointed out is that generally SIL is a few percent of development cost. It varies, obviously. Some developments it might be 1 or 2%, it might go up to 4, 5, 6%, but it's something which can usually be absorbed by reducing the value of land or land cost of the development. So it doesn't it's not normally like the main factor which would stop a development from coming forward. So us introducing SIL shouldn't really put the brakes on developments coming forward. And as Councillor Manrose kind of outlined earlier, there's kind of a transition. You're almost taking a different bite from the same apple as Section 106. So there is the council has the opportunity to get more money in because it will be able to capture SIL from small developments where we don't currently charge any Section 106. So if you're building several houses, you currently don't pay anything for your infrastructure for your residents, whereas we will now be capturing some money from that. Whereas on the big developments, they're often usually paying Section 106, and we will just be getting a more flexible way of spending some of the same money. So the money shouldn't go up too much. It might go up slightly. It's very difficult to say exactly how it will be a case by case basis. But overall, on large developments, SIL, I don't think will have much of an impact. It should be fairly negligible for developers, and it shouldn't. And also at the same time, Anthony Lee's confirmed that it shouldn't have too much of an impact on our affordable housing delivery as well. Again, because the amount that the value goes up should be taken out of the cost that is paid for the development land.
I was just going to, the issue is what happens is once that's in the system, if a developer is going to go and buy a parcel of land in our borough, they will put it in their appraisal that they've got, just like they do with the London SIL, every single appraisal for land purchase, the developer will put London SIL is this much per square meter. So it's a known fact. So there's no haggling and there's no sort of room for error. So many developers actually prefer that SIL system because they don't need to then have to argue with the planning officer to say, and then it goes backwards and forwards, and sometimes developments are stuck for a long time in the planning process because our officers will say, we think you can pay this, and they'll say we can pay this, and then there's a lot of toing and froing. So that will go away. But what will happen on the larger developments is most developers, they don't really look at how they're paying the money. They look at, usually when you talk to them, they look at it in terms of they're building 400 homes. How much is the tax? Is it 6,000 per unit? Is it 7,000 per unit? What was the last development that took place? How much did they pay? So they compare themselves against other large developments. And if you're way out of sync, they won't come to your borough. But if you're in that region, all that would happen is the 106 will actually drop down. There's a lot of the stuff that the 106, the mitigation, would be done by SIL. So large developments will not face a massive increase. But as the officer said, if you build 9 homes in the borough today, you don't pay a single penny towards any infrastructure or any sort of development that, any sort of mitigation. Nothing is chargeable. Whereas with SIL, every single new addition, except for small extensions or whatever, if you're building a new home, you will have to pay SIL. So we will get a bigger pot, but it will come from different parts of the development industry, and it won't be coming from the same large developments that come forward.
There was the last question was just about learning from other authorities who already have SIL and
Sure. So
governance issues.
there is a pan-London SIL collection group that's stood up by TfL that's quarterly. I attend that. I've been attending that for like 6 or 7 years. I've got lots of contacts. That's how I managed to ask Marilyn to very kindly come along this evening. So yeah, no, we'll definitely learn. And also I come from a background of delivering SIL in another London borough, in London Borough of Havering. I took over SIL just after the point we're at now. The council had just adopted it. I designed all the governance, ran it for 4 or 5 years and tweaked it and worked with it. Havering, similar to Barking Dagenham, has less potential to bring in SIL, so the amounts were smaller, but I've seen various different ways of doing this, and I've studied this for many years, so I'll bring that knowledge to bear in terms of advising how we can set up SIL, looking at different options. I found that having a 2 or 3 speed process where you have saving for big ticket items, you have medium ticket items in the hundreds of thousands which are picked up from the IDP and align with the capital programme, and then having a smaller flexible bits of money, which is either picked up through NSIL or within strategic, so which picks up sort of small infrastructure, can be a really good way of doing this. So I'm going to put this forward in options papers. Obviously, I'm not the decision maker, but I can advise decision makers on pros and cons of different approaches. And so, no, I think we will definitely look to learn from other boroughs, certainly.
Thank you very much. I think there are 2 bits, and I'm going to prime Marilyn in preparation for kind of, so she has a little bit of time to think about it. Should be a question of everything you've heard from our Ealing officers. Do you think they've made good judgments? Do you think there's anything that's kind of like a bear trap that we need to be worried about? You can mark their homework in public. But the sort of first question is in terms of the money that we're currently getting in Section 106, and think, Councillor, there will still be a Section 106 negotiation post the implementation of SIL, so it's not quite as smooth as you may have maybe made it sound. How will the total receipts now versus post the implementation of SIL compare, and what does that different stream, because the 5-6 million, like, will SIL be the 2 million that makes up to 8? Will Section 106 still be the 2 million that makes up to 8 to give us that sort of bigger number that we've had since 22?
I mean, the main issue to look at is it's difficult to compare the future with the past, given where we're at with the current development industry. We're in a slight unknown. I don't think anyone can fully say where we'll be in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time. But if we tried to take an average and pretend that we are on a sort of similar path to where we were before, you should be with SIL, we should be bringing in more money than we were with Section 106, because some Section 106 will be replaced by SIL. There should be no Section 106 that's falling away as a result of being SIL. So any Section 106 which is lost should be picked up by SIL or just replaced by, but there should also be this ability to capture some funding from smaller developments, and when you add those windfall sites together, they can add up to quite a lot. And Ealing is a very big borough, and we do have quite a lot of 6, 7, 8, 9 unit schemes which will be able to capture affordable, so we'll be able to capture a SIL charge from. But to actually try and quantify that at this point in time, I can't do that because I don't have the data. That's something which at future boards in a year or so's time, when we've actually got some developments approved, those size, I can start to do the calculations and see what liability notices we've issued for developments, and we can actually give some actual figures. At the moment, the figures I've given are indicative. I've been pushed to provide those. I'm not fully comfortable with them. They're the best I can do with what I've got and the time I've had, but we will look to provide much better figures for forecasting once we have the data for that.
Councillor Dinter is very keen to ask a question. So if
no, I could wait if you want me to, but I just want to come back to the point which I raised earlier about fighting inequality. I think here's a huge opportunity for us to ring fence some of the money from 80% which we are allocating for strategic CIL to the most deprived wards in the borough. When I first came onto the council, there was only about 5 or 7 wards, one might recall, in the whole of the borough, with 4 being in Southall, 1 in Greenford, and I think the other one was in Acton. But now there are more than 13 or 14 wards in the borough which are the most deprived ward. I think there's no pot of money to address the depredation in those wards. I think here's the opportunity for us to allocate 15, maybe 20% out of the 80% strategic CIL to these wards. I think that's the opportunity we should explore if we can.
What I'd say, it is within the SIL regulations the SIL regulations do allow you the flexibility to explore what you've suggested, Councillor Dinter. That's for the decision makers to look at. I know that they're aware that there is a drive to try and spread the money more evenly across the borough. And whilst the neighbourhood SIL portion can only be spent on certain things, it's possible that, provided that the SIL spend still meets the requirements of the strategic SIL, i.e. it's delivering infrastructure, then there could be some more community say or some other different governance on how some of that money is ring-fenced or allocated. But that's something which we need to be looked at in more detail.
Councillor Dinter, we will be making recommendations very shortly, and I suspect you may have a recommendation on that. So Marilyn, I think as we kind of close off our SIL portion, it would be good to have you mark our homework for us.
If I could just come back on that one, two of our recent ones, or we're putting up for allocation, one of them is to have 25 rapid deployment CCTV cameras for the whole borough. So we can then go into the wards and put them in the wards where they're most needed, where there's fear of crime and fly tipping. And another borough-wide is replacing all the litter bins and getting a new grab lorry to go to tackle the fly tipping in smaller areas, which again is going to be a lot more in the deprived areas. So you can be flexible rather than just kind of give a pot of money. You can do borough-wide schemes like that as well. And in terms of your 106, the air quality team said, "Oh, can we have some SIL money to do some air quality monitoring stations?" And I just said, "No, you've got 100,000 106 to do the air quality monitoring." So and that's one thing I do think you're going to do very well here, because when you've got the same team who has the SIL and 106, it's all developer contributions, so it's all for infrastructure. So you can kind of put them together, and they can work together for things. So like you might have said, "Oh, well, we want to use some SIL for certain parks." Then a development comes along and the developer's going to pay 106 to do something in one of those parks, and you think, "Well, that's good, we'll get 106 for that." Then that SIL can move somewhere else. So having the same team in place so far in advance of it and running the whole project for you, I think is really great, because you can manage all the contributions that come in, and you can really manage, and having the up-to-date IDP as well, you can program in advance when the money comes in as to when the works are going to be done, and you can use both sets of money and other funding, whichever comes in as well. There's always funding from other things where the SIL and the 106 can help top it up. So yes, I think you've got it easy. With developers know what it is. Every other borough in London they develop in, they pay SIL, so they'll just pay your SIL. There'll be absolutely no problem for them paying the SIL. And yeah, you are lucky. I think it's going to go well, and glad you're doing it, because why not? Every developers are paying that money to every other borough, so don't let yourself miss out.
So from what you've heard then from our officers, and we're very grateful for the time that they've taken, that they understand the reality of implementing it, that there is a high quality kind of plan underpinning all of this, that they've not concerned themselves with any of the kind of challenges they're going to face. It's all well prepared, and we're ready for, if full council approves it, for a March implementation date.
Yeah, I'm quite confident. I think your next step is, as Ben said, is getting the governance in place as to how you're going to, what sort of contracts you're going to do, how you're going to allocate it, what sort of monitoring. One thing we are about to start is using our SIL admin fee to get someone in place who's going to do publicity on it. So when someone's done their project, to say, "This is what the council's done. Don't be scared of this development, because this development has now paid for extensions to this health centre for this youth project." So you've got a bonus to sell developments almost, or sell your growth to the residents. So we're trying to do that, put up a web page, and I have to say, we've been collecting SIL for 10 years and we haven't got round to that yet. So I'm sure you'll be a lot more on the ball than we were.
Fantastic. Thank you, Councillor Manrick.
Sorry, I was just, because there are other pots of funding that we collect as part of the planning service. So for instance, I think we've collected over £6 million for carbon offsetting. And I think one of the projects that they've done is 1,250 homes have had energy saving measures installed in those homes. We've done I think we've done a whole sort of area where we've made it zero passive homes, and that was a big investment. And we do get grants from central government as well. And sometimes, the cost of living, we can prioritize some of our poor areas for things like that kind of intervention in. And we've been talking to people like Octopus Energy, where as a social landlord, they're promising if we invest with them, they can make many homes zero bills for up to 10 years. So if we let them invest, and as a landlord, we invest some money, we can actually have properties that would not face any energy bills for up to 10 years. And that could be part of our, that we have wider programs which are ongoing, which don't often get publicity, but that's happening day in, day out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to move swiftly on to recommendations for this first part. So councillors, do we have any recommendations? I know Councillor Dintz has got one. Thank you. And Gallant, Councillor Gallant.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, key point, governance and monitoring. So have a strict reporting and make sure the public and the residents are absolutely aware of what the revenue is, because then they'll start believing that in the dynamic of developments.
Understand that what that proposal is, because we are setting aside for the town teams that our residents will allocate up to 15% of sale. So then the strategic sale that's left is around delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, which we would would have political priorities on, but those are projects that would be delivered borough-wide. So it wouldn't really matter where, and we would just prioritize the ones that we want to do, and they would that sale would pay for it. So are we saying we set aside a higher percentage than the 15, or some other version?
I think it would be that of the overall spend that proportion would be spent on the most deprived wards. Of obviously larger infrastructure spends, a share would therefore in effect be allocated to a more deprived area without having to specifically spend it in that area.
It is feasible to it. I think there's no other part of money which we have for the most deprived wards or have it in there unless.
I think if the recommendation is that there be a focus on ensuring that development takes place in the most deprived wards, that in a year's time we can come back and see how that has worked, and if a defined proportion is required when we actually know what the numbers are, because we don't currently know exactly what numbers are coming in and how it is spent, that could be the right way to look at that.
Chair, as the officer pointed out, it'll take up to 3 years for really any sort of money to come in. So this is maybe a bit too early for us to do this kind of.
We also don't manage it. It's a recommendation, not an enforceable rule. So I think let's not. So Councillor Nagpal.
Maybe just slightly different to what Councillor Dins is saying. On the doorstep, we get a lot of residents saying you've put up all these developments, but does the infrastructure on the ground support it? So I think personally, my recommendation would be to focus first and foremost on that, so that the residents who are already living there are not negatively impacted by these. And that's essentially how we should be spending SIL money, in my opinion.
Okay. In terms of, I mean, I think I note that a lot of what was being recommended is quite similar to the process we've got for Your Voice, Your Town, which is you have that town team that then chooses how money is spent locally. So that is a good thing. The recommendation is also the importance of long-term thinking within how SIL spend is planned to ensure that there is connection between all the different pots of money, and it's important that there is a thread that runs through all of it. Spending money, time and effort on publicising the SIL process is important to ensure good participation, just as clear and transparent allocation and bidding processes are important to ensure that the public can have full confidence in how money is but both decided how it's spent and then how it's allocated. And I think we're not entirely clear on exactly how much political priority is allowed to be defined in the setting of the SIL rate, but that there should be maybe a dedicated part of the council plan, given that kind of 4-yearly process that delivers that indicates what the council priorities are for SIL rate setting, even if those are not necessarily the ones that end up finally being set if they get challenged by the kind of, how often are they challenged? Like,
sorry, they were challenged at examination, but now we can actually change them virtually with a year's sort of notice.
But we'd have to
have
go
them
through the
examined
process, yeah.
again, but they can be done. It can be done. Yeah.
Okay, are we content with those recommendations that have been drafted? I think Julian did a
Well, governance, yeah, governance is transparent. So transparent reporting will build up confidence in the whole system. Yeah.
Chair, what are we saying about the deprived?
what did we
15%, unfunded proportionate of 15% to the most deprived wards within the borough.
so at the moment the draft recommendation is 15% be ring fenced for the most deprived wards in the borough. We have to agree that or not agree that. The recommendation from officers is that it may be premature to commit to such a specifically defined share. So are we keen to agree to that, or would we prefer to agree to something more broader, which just says that there should be a focus on ensuring development in the most deprived areas of the borough?
Insert something.
A suggestion, yes. I'm happy with that. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, the recommendation there.
I don't know what we have agreed.
So the current agreement will be a recommendation that a specific focus be given by SIL expenditure to promote development in the most deprived parts of the borough, but without defining a specific number at this point, but with also a specific recommendation to look back at it once SIL spend is more clearly understood as it begins to actually percolate into the system, to consider whether a specific number would be a useful metric.
Any in-depth analysis whether it's feasible or not, and then decide one way or the other whether we can do it or not. That's what I was suggesting in my recommendation. Okay, anyway, move on.
Thank you very much. So we're happy with those recommendations. Fantastic. So at that point, I would like to say particularly thank you very much to Marilyn for her attendance this evening. We're very grateful to you. I think you're now free to leave, which gives you at least some of your evening back. So thank you very much for your time. And we're now going to move on to a very brief update on the development and preparation of the local plan.
Thank you very much, Chair. So what is a local plan? It's a...
Sorry, and also thanks to Ben for his time as well. Sorry, I didn't.
Okay, so what is a local plan? So it helps shape and guide future development in an area. It's part of the plan-led system, which is our planning system, which basically means that any planning decisions that are taken by planning committee or delegated to your officers must be taken in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. The other advantage of a local plan is it creates certainty so that developers or investors know where there are sites where development possibilities exist, and so does the local community. And of course, it enables us then to assess the sort of type of development we want and the sort of quantums of development and the scale of development might be appropriate, so that there is less doubt about what might be happening in the future. And this all operates within a framework of national and regional planning policy. That's illustrated in this next slide. And in the case of regional policy here, I'm referring to the London Plan, which is, of course, the Mayor of London. And it's important to note that, of course, strategic planning is now being reintroduced across the rest of England as well. And the London Plan is an integral part of our local plan. So the policies in the London Plan are just as important as the policies in our local plan and vice versa. The London Plan sets out a framework for how London will develop, and it sets a number of very important development metrics for each of the participating local planning authorities. So things like housing supply, how waste apportionment is managed, urban greening, urban energy efficiency and so forth, together with a comprehensive set of policies that are used to help guide the determination of individual planning applications. And our local plan has to be in general conformity with the London plan. And that's a principle that's also now being re-established across the rest of the country. That doesn't mean that you can't do something different from the London plan. In fact, we have form and track record for so doing, but you need to have evidence to justify why you might have adopted a different approach based on local circumstances. I should say that the local plan doesn't cover the whole of the London Borough of Ealing. Our local plan only covers most of the borough. It doesn't include what's called the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, the northeast corner of the borough around North Acton and Park Royal. And that's because that is a separate local planning authority, which has separate local plan making powers. So I can't, in our local plan, set policies for that corner of the borough. I should also point out that it's possible to produce what's called joint plans. So we are party to something called the Joint West London Waste Plan, with 6 neighbouring local authorities. That was produced back in 2015. We're in the process of revising that, and Cabinet approved, I think last week, a proposal for our new plan with a round of consultation scheduled to begin on the 10th of December for 8 weeks. Well, I'm going to be addressing primarily the local plan here. It's also worth pointing out there are 2 what are called neighbourhood plans. These are community-led plans, so they're not run by the council, although we are responsible for providing advice and for taking the plan through the examination and adoption stages. And they cover Central and West Ealing. They have fairly limited scope and will be now largely superseded when the new local plan is eventually adopted. Neighbourhood plans meet certain basic conditions and have to be in conformity with strategic policies in Ealing's local plan. I thought it's useful just to highlight some of the key changes that have taken place, both to national and regional planning policy, particularly over the last year or so. Of course, everyone will be very familiar with the government's new target of 1.5 million new homes to be delivered during this parliamentary term. I've already referred to the restoration of strategic planning. We expect before Christmas, and my firm prediction is it will probably be published the week before Christmas itself, is a new set of national development management policies alongside a new national planning policy framework. And this will set in more detail development policies nationally, which will then automatically form part of the planning policy framework for all of the geographies of the country. There is also a proposal for what's called a new standard method. So this is the way in which housing targets are assessed and set by government. And in London, that's resulted in almost doubling of London's housing supply target to 88,000 homes per annum. The Mayor of London has now published a new document in March of this year, setting out his vision for the new London plan, which we expect will be published in the summer of next year. And your officers are working very closely with the Mayor's team in terms of delivering various aspects of the evidence base. We, for example, produce quite a lot of work around looking at potential housing capacity across London, looking at waste apportionment targets, affordable housing and so forth. And of course, there's been huge concern about house building numbers and delivery generally. As you know, we have the almost perfect storm at the moment in terms of viability and issues around costs and so forth. And government mayoral intervention has now been mooted in the form of the housing stimulus package, which is about to be consulted very shortly. I would add to this slide the work that's being done around digital innovation, because I think that also has huge potential to drive efficiencies through the local planning system. And it's worth just pointing out, because it's topical, the Secretary of State today made a ministerial statement where he announced some further new measures. In his words, unleashing development around railway stations with a default yes to suitable planning applications and development in reasonable walking distance of well-connected stations, although I note you never define what suitable, reasonable or well-connected was, so I'll await the detail on that. He also proposed intervening to support growth, requiring local planning authorities, including your planning committee, to notify the Secretary of State if they intend to refuse an application for more than 150 homes, and in which case the Secretary of State may choose to call it in to intervene, although that measure will require new legislation. And we've also learnt today that proposals for streamlining statutory consultation, these are consultees in the planning application process, that consultation has now begun, and they're proposing to remove Sport England, the Gardens Trust and the Theatres Trust from that list of consultees. So this slide illustrates the stages in producing a local plan. We're currently at stage 6, and this followed a process of evidence gathering, including the infrastructure delivery plan, which we heard about earlier, and 2 main rounds of public and stakeholder consultation. We submitted the local plan almost a year ago, almost at our first anniversary, on November the 24th of last year, following full council's approval of our final version of the plan in February of last year. So the examination process is then presided over by an independent inspector who is appointed by the Secretary of State. In fact, we have 2 inspectors, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So in terms of the priorities in the local plan, you'll hopefully be pleased to learn they reflect very strongly and are very strongly correlated with the priorities that you've set out in your own council plan. So there are the 3 overarching golden threads, as I prefer to call them, strategic objectives around the climate crisis, fighting inequality, which is already mentioned, about creating good jobs and growth, which is my colleague's portfolio. And sitting beneath that are the 9 priorities. The plan itself sets out a 15-year vision for Ealing, which, as I say, is closely aligned to this, and it seeks to ensure that those strategic objectives guide how the borough develops and informs the vision, and that vision then in turn shapes the policies in the plan. And this slide illustrates the vision, and again, picked out in green, you can see each of the 9 priorities highlighted, and it seeks to essentially enhance the unique characteristics and cultural identities of each of Ealing's 7 towns and reflects the 9 priorities identified in the council plan. In terms of the timetable then, we conducted our first round of consultation on initial proposals back in 2023. Our final proposals were consulted upon in 2024. As I said before, we submitted as Secretary of State November 24th, 24. The inspector was then appointed. We then had a round of initial questions, issues and matters, which were responded to in February, March of 2025. We've had a first block of public hearings, which was held in this room in June of this year. We've then, over the summer, been responding to a second batch of issues and matters and additional information on a number of areas of concern to the inspectors. That's now been completed. We're now eagerly anticipating in a few weeks' time the second block of public hearings, which will be in December, concluding December the 18th. And those hearings this time won't be in person, they will be online, they will be virtual. We then expect to hear from the inspectors in terms of any modifications they may require, and then subject to the inspector's report, we will then be able to adopt the plan, providing obviously we're found to be sound. So what is the point of the examination? Well, let me tell you, I think I've so far had to answer 2,000 questions in writing, plus I lost count how many questions we were asked orally in the hearings. So I think all participants, whatever your views on the local plan, would agree that the whole process has been highly robust and almost forensic in its detail. And the inspector's job, as I say, representing the Secretary of State, is to ask whether or not the plan has met various legal tests of compliance. For example, did we do work around sustainability appraisal? Did we look at the equality impacts of the plan? Did we satisfy the duty to cooperate? In other words, did we involve our neighbours and certain statutory stakeholders? And did we consult the public and other stakeholders? Those are very important tests. If you fail those tests, you fail. That's the end of the process. Then the other tests are what are called tests of soundness, subject to the appetite of the inspectorate. These are matters which are potentially repairable during the examination process, and they're looking at four main things: whether the plan has been positively prepared, whether your approach is justified, whether your policies are effective, and of course whether or not policies are consistent with national planning policy. And then finally, I've suggested some reading, which I will test you on later. Obviously, the plan itself, which you should be familiar with, councillors, because you approved it at full council in February 2024. So my job is to try and get as much of that plan through the examination process successfully. And just to give you a flavour, and I wasn't suggesting you read an awful lot of these documents, there are 325 documents now. That's gone up since I produced a slide on the website. So I only recommend it for the insomniacs amongst you, but I suggest having a brief look just so you understand the scale and scope of work, both in terms of the technical input and the range of community consultation, etc., that we were required to do to get the plan through the Mincer. And then mainly because it was short, but I think because it might also be topical and relevant to your scope, I also suggested the barriers to housing delivery and action plan that we produce, which is a short but fairly depressing read about the current state of the housing market and the challenges that we face in trying to meet our various objectives, particularly around house building. So I'll pause there for questions.
Thank you very much. I suppose a sort of a broader political question, and then maybe some slightly more specific one. Is it even really possible to write a local plan anymore, given that there are about 17 different things that, when they change, impact our ability to fulfil the plan that we would like to, which is maybe the broader kind of political question. And then more specifically, that's clearly, as you've indicated, a rather robust process you've been expected to go through. Is it also is it unduly onerous? Does it actually impact our ability to, I mean, I don't know if you can move back to the timeline, but if we're talking about a 2023 start date for that process and we haven't got one yet, and we might not have one until presumably the middle of next year, you've gone a very long time. Is our local plan already out of date by the time at which it becomes the kind of the guiding document it is? And then on that inspection process, do local authorities fail that inspection? It sounds as though they must do, given the number of questions. Is passing first time a great success? Is it a kind of common for local authorities to go and well prepared? Or, yeah, if you could just let us know that. Thank you.
So the answer to all three of those questions, in short, is yes, it is very onerous. Yes, the plan will be out of date as soon as we adopt it, and we almost immediately will be into review. And yes, local planning authorities do fail examination process, but let me amplify.
So
yeah, no.
So look, the issue is many local authorities, let's say they have political priorities which are not necessarily ones that we would have. Many local authorities don't want development in their area because it's easier for them to sort of deal with their local residents by saying we're not going to allow any building, and therefore development has been sort of haphazard in many parts of the country, in terms of some local authorities have not had a local plan for 30, 40 years. They've just not bothered. Others,
in York's case, 60
years in York. All right. So a local authority is quite sovereign in what it can do in its area. I mean, people misunderstand sometimes. We're able to make decisions which can be quite wrong in the sense of, in serving our local communities, because politicians have set different priorities. A local plan will help us in managing the development, sort of planning development, in terms of how do you make judgments on applications. Each one is on its merits, And yes, a local plan is usually running out of date by the time you adopt it. And this one in particular is going to be, I mean, we've made it very clear there'll be a review as soon as we adopt this local plan. There will be a review and a move towards another local plan, because our housing targets are moving from 2,000 something, we think, to 3,000 something. And that would indicate that we would need to look at some of our policies around brownfield site, and believe it or not, we still have green belt between us and Hillingdon. I don't know what that green belt is doing, because there's development on both sides, but we do have those sort of issues that we will need to look at. So this plan will give us guidance, and this plan is actually more than just some of the policies. It's around how we view carbon offsetting, how we view net zero, how we view inequality, how we view development in the borough. So some of those won't change, but what might change is some of the policies to deliver the homes that we need to deliver. So that's why we would need a review. But it is a great tool that you can use to manage your development proposals that are coming into the borough. And yes, the railway stations and all the rest of it. So how do you make those judgments? And that's what this will do. That will help us, but it is potentially out of date by the time we adopt it.
I couldn't get you an external speaker, but perhaps what I can do is I can perhaps wear a different hat, because I also am a member of the Planning Officer Society board. I chair their spatial plans network, and I'm their lead subject specialist on local plans. And so what Planning Officer Society have been saying is that, yes, the current local plan making system is far too onerous, and we have supported the government's proposals to streamline the process, in particular the examination process. And Ealing's example, I think, is a classic case in point. The government quite rightly is aiming to have universal local plan coverage for the whole of the country, and that has not been achieved in a long time. It has also put in place measures to provide better resources for planning departments, and including has embraced digital innovation and technology, which I think, as I indicated earlier, has the scope and potential to help the process. They've also set very strict time limits as to how long local plans should be prepared. I do have some concerns about some of that in terms of the detail, because they're proposing what are called 3 gateway assessments, and that's obviously going to require the planning inspectorate to mobilise considerable resources on its side, particularly staffing, to be able to manage that process. And that will also have an impact on statutory bodies who have had a pretty poor record in terms of responding on individual local plans, except at the final proposal stage, the Reg 19 stage. So it is onerous, but I'm encouraged by what I hear. I mean, too often I've heard in the past, we're going to streamline the process. We've ended up there with regulations which made the process twice as long, twice as complicated. The devil will be in the detail, and we will see more of that detail in the coming months. And I'm hopeful that we will see some positive signs and developments. In terms of out of date, I think it's important to note that we have had a change in government. That government has obviously brought in a whole raft of new measures, not least the new standard method and new housing targets, which, as the councillor has said, will have a major impact, not just on us, but on the whole of London. And so clearly the assumptions that we were making when we were drawing up the draft Ealing local plan was based on different policy imperatives, and all of those have now changed. So we will have to adapt. So it's almost inevitable. That will firstly be reflected in a new London plan. So that's where we will find what our God-given new housing supply target will be. And then we will have to fashion a way locally as to how we think we might be able to meet that. And just to, again, provide a bit more detail, unlike other areas, in London, we've always worked out housing delivery targets on the basis of capacity. So where you have land and where you have brownfield land in particular, and where you have the capacity to be able to build and provide units, that may enable you to be able to make a bigger contribution towards London housing needs than possibly an area where there isn't that many sites. And in terms of failure, most of those local planning authorities that have failed examinations have usually done so on the altar of the duty to cooperate. And I've long argued that that was a complete anachronism and wasn't fit for purpose. And you remember it was brought in at the time when previous government abolished strategic planning in England outside London. Now, the need for the duty to cooperate effectively evaporates now with the restoration of strategic planning, because you were setting up many individual local planning authorities outside London to fail, particularly in the southeast of England, because you had, for example, towns or cities which had very restricted borders, so they had no land on which to build, but they were expanding, they were thriving, but their neighbouring authorities, which possibly contained large girdles of green belt, were resistant to development. And there was no ability to bring those parties together except through the rather weak and feeble duty to cooperate to try and resolve some of those strategic issues. So the government's plan, so far as I understand it, is we will have a proper system of strategic planning with a revised, controversial in some areas, I have to say, units of local government to address these issues. Those strategic issues will therefore be dealt with at the higher level, which will make individual local authorities' plans much more easier because those targets have now been set. So, you know, those are all real problems, but I am wearing my POS hat, encouraged that there are green shoots.
Councillor Gallant.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, and yeah, thank you, Steve. I mean, I actually quite a lot I wanted to ask. You've actually gone through, so I just wanted to ask you about the upcoming block or the upcoming, you know, the December event, which I believe was going to be in September, wasn't it? It was moved to December, and I read the plethora of letters that you've answered, and I can test me. I can. But it's a lot. So the question is really, what's going to come up in December that hasn't already been covered? What do you anticipate that hasn't already been covered? And just if you could go into the London plan, because I mean, for the layman, it looks like the London plan could come in and wreck the local plan. And we're thinking about affordable housing targets and whether they're going to be reduced in order to stimulate more building. So just a little bit on that, please.
Okay, so what's not covered? So basically there were 10 matters that were identified by the 2 inspectors. So in block 1, we largely dealt with matters 1 to 5, which was legal procedural issues, the duty to cooperate, our spatial strategy, town plans, and I've forgotten what the other one is now.
Is it Gypsies and Travellers?
I think it was to do with vision and so forth. Okay. Oh, sorry, it was housing. So it did include Gypsy Travel, sorry, and housing supply, housing delivery. So there are some residual matters because the inspectors weren't entirely satisfied with some of our answers. So we've been on the first day of block 2, we're going to revisit some of those, in particular Gypsy Travellers, and in particular our housing land supply situation, because clearly, like every other London borough, effectively, we've seen a complete drop-off in terms of housing completions and a failure to meet the housing delivery test, which has resulted in us having to produce an action plan, which we've published as part of the block of documents that we produced over the summer. So the other matters that we'll be dealing with in that block are to do with design, tall buildings and historic environment. That's one block. We've got our whole block of policies around climate change, you know, where we are being very innovative and cutting edge, going far further than the London plan, for example, on things like net zero and carbon offsetting and so forth, energy efficiency and so forth. We'll also be dealing with the town plans, so the detailed proposals we have for place shaping across our 7 towns. We'll also be dealing with the development sites. We have 82 site allocations proposed in the plan, so we'll be going probably very forensically through those. Needless to say, some of our policies haven't gone down entirely well with aspects of the development industry, particularly our restrictions on building height in some geographies, for example, where there's some pushback, for example. And then finally, there's a session on monitoring and review. So those are the matters to be considered. Oh, and then there's a wrecking ball of the London plan.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. Well,
if
it is, yes. I mean, that's.
Well, I mean, clearly, obviously, the London plan is going to change. As I think I think the London plan will be a very different animal this time to the one that we are used to, because so far as I understand, the new culture that's being created around strategic plans will not just be big local plans, and in many respects the London plan was. It included quite a lot of development management policies, for example. Now, I am probably somebody who's always welcomed that, because the more the London plan did, the more heavy lifting that did, the less I had to do in my local plan. So, for example, if you look at our chapter 5, which is our DM policies, it's the thinnest chapter in the plan. It's the thinnest DM policy chapter of any London borough. And I should say our adopted local plan adopts the same process. And that's because we in Ealing took the decision not to replicate and duplicate policies in the London plan. A, there's no necessity. You say it twice doesn't make it any more important. But secondly, if you do try and say it twice, but you have slightly different tone or emphasis, there is the potential for developers and others to therefore twist the words and to create different interpretations of policy. So it's best to be crystal and very, very clear about that. And I have to say that principle, by the way, is being adopted by government, because what it's saying is, you know, we produce all these local plans up and down the country. Many of them have the same design policy broadly, you know, or the same policy on heritage. That should be in national policy. It's how you then implement that design policy or that heritage policy, for example, in locally specific circumstances, which is what the local plan should be attempting to do. So it's much more about place shaping in your area rather than having generic planning policies. And in principle, I support that with one proviso, again, wearing my POS hat here, that of course you want to encourage innovation and experimentation locally. Indeed, many of our best local policies, particularly around climate action, for example, have been because of innovation in different geographies. So by having one size fits all nationally, that could prevent innovation. So what we've said in Planning Officer Society is that, yes, that's a good thing, but clearly policy that would apply from Northumberland to Cornwall to Deal, that's clearly not going to work. Where local circumstances and the evidence supports a different local approach or a different local policy, perhaps a higher target, then you should be allowed to do that, and that should be signed off by an inspector in the examination process. Okay, so the London plan clearly, obviously, is being prepared now for potential consultation next year. As I say, the form and structure of that, I think, shouldn't be taken for granted. I don't think we should necessarily assume it's going to look like the old London plan based on where the guidance is likely to land in terms of strategic planning. And as I say, a large part of that DM policy bit will be hoovered up into national policy, so they won't need to replicate those. So I envisage the London plan being a lot shorter. So what it should be addressing is, what are the challenges London faces? Where are the opportunities for growth and development? And how do we share that out spatially across London? What are the priorities and where are the best nodes of development? Okay, and what are the strategic priorities for infrastructure and how can that be best funded, for example? So it'll provide that big picture, if you like, of London. And then it'll be up to us in the local planning authorities to then decide, based on some of those choices that have been made centrally, about how that then fits into our particular place, our particular geography. That is going to be challenging because, as already been hinted at, it is very likely our housing delivery target is going to increase exponentially. And again, just to put some figures on this, the London plan housing delivery target for Ealing LPA, so it doesn't include North Acton and Park Royal, so that will be in addition, is currently 2,157 net new homes per annum. Under the last government's old standard method, it would have gone up to 3,632. The last new standard method under the current government brought it down 6% to 3,407. So that's still almost 50% higher than our current target. If you set that against average net completions over the last 3 years, we've delivered on average just under 1,450 net new homes per annum. Now, next year's figure will be a lot lower because housing supply has fallen off a cliff. So our cumulative average over the last 3 years will be even lower. I think our top year, which was actually during COVID, because we were still seeing the tail off of developments that had commenced prior to COVID, was 1,885 net homes per annum. So you set our delivery, our track record against the current target, we're still not meeting it. We've still got some way to go. You set it against a likely new target, it's going to be quite a big difference. Now, we don't know what the new target is yet, just to say, I'm quoting those figures from the standard method. The way in which I understand it's going to work is the London plan target is the aggregate of all the standard method targets of each of the local planning authorities in London. But how the Mayor of London then distributes that across the London boroughs will not be based on the standard method, it will be based on capacity. So our figure could be higher, it could be lower, it could be the standard method figure. My best guess is it's likely to be higher, because particularly given the constraints of some of the inner London authorities in terms of brownfield land and the ability to develop, the greater scope and opportunity probably does exist in the suburbs. And I think that's the reason why we've seen proposals around grey belt, green belt release as a way of possibly trying to square that circle.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I suppose, do we have questions from, happy to, brief answer might be appreciated. Talk about the massive discrepancy between the number of current completions and what we expect the target to be. What is there any provision within the local plan to close that gap? What in terms of push factor is there to encourage further development, and how do we meet that challenge given everything we've heard about the kind of problems of getting new buildings underway?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the local plan works in tandem with other council strategies. So obviously a very key thing this year was the publication of the council's housing strategy. And on the back of that, we've now been able to produce a housing action plan, housing delivery plan, which obviously is working in tandem with the housing strategy and the local plan to deliver that. That was on your reading list, so I won't necessarily go through that, but I think that's a very good short read in terms of describing the problems and how we might seek to address those. Government certainly has put great store on the planning system. I'm trying to rectify problems within that, and I've highlighted some of the key reforms that are being proposed. Clearly, obviously, there's the stimulus package, which has also been mentioned earlier. Again, my view is that's addressing some of the symptoms, not necessarily the causes. Clearly, obviously, the major issue at the moment is that developers, because of the perfect storm that I outlined in that paper, are not bringing schemes to market because there is no demand. So we have this rather paradoxical situation where the need for housing, particularly affordable housing, is obvious, but there aren't the people who are able to afford the housing products that are being provided by the housing industry. And so therefore, we're not seeing the supply come through. Now, the developers, as outlined in that paper, will tell you the reasons why. Again, spoiler alert, I don't want to tread on Rachel Reeves's toes, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if we see some sort of demand-led stimulus, a sort of, help to buy on steroids type scheme being announced in the budget to try and provide some way of cushioning that blow. But, even registered providers, which have often helped developers out in difficult periods because of issues around funding, and in particular around having to meet the requirements post-Grenfell around the building regulations standards, they are not providing the same level of grants and purchase that they would have of surplus private developer stocks at the moment. So they've almost retreated from the market.
Sorry, I was just going to add, in terms of some of our policy sort of interventions, one of them is around our move away from shared ownership, which in 95% of the borough is, Savills did the report. It's a very comprehensive report. I'll ask you to look at it if you want. It said that 95% of the borough, people can't afford shared ownership. It's an unaffordable product. So we moved towards a rental product, So with rent, what happens is you can actually not be waiting for people to buy those homes, so you can build at pace. So in Greenford, the Greystar development hasn't stopped. They're going to build 2,100 and they're just piling on. If you go there, the building is not stopping, because as the new blocks get built, they get rented out. So therefore, build to rent product can be delivered at pace. So for instance, Berkeley now got permission for over 8,000. And I think they built 600 so far. So that site could deliver us at pace our target. So that's why we bought 180 homes from Berkeley, which was going to be for the private market. And now they'll be socially rented products, but they'll build them, so we'll get them next year. We bought 110 from Countryside, same principle. They were going to go into the private market and they were not going to build them because they're not selling any. So by us buying them, we get them to build them so that that project can carry on. They can keep their skill base still there with the builders and all the rest of it. And so what we're trying to do with government is to lobby them to let us have the capital or the borrowing ability for us to actually get the private developers to build for us at a lower rate. They'll make less profit, but they can keep their overhead costs going. They can keep their supply chains going, and then they keep their sort of the employees employed. And if the government does that, that enables us to carry on the delivery at a much faster pace. And so those are some of the things we're looking at in terms of policy interventions at a local level for us to deliver high quality homes at pace. It's the pace that's the problem. And therefore, I mean, I think the figure I saw last year, this year, there was about 5,000 something homes sold in the whole of London, private homes, and about 3,000 starts in the whole of London. So you can see, I mean, we are the top borough in London for affordable housing starts, but don't ask me to tell you the number because it's so low that I'd be embarrassed.
Yeah.
But I will say, because Sutton was second. Can you believe that? I think we started 224 homes, and that made us the top in London, right? So there is a massive problem, and we've got to use all our policy interventions to get A, the supply chain to carry on, and B, not to lose the skill set that the builders and all the rest of it. Because if we lose those, then it's really hard to get the supply chain going again. So we're trying to get the supply chain going.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. Fantastic. Thank you very much. I wonder whether members of the panel. Okay, I was going to say move to recommendations, but if you do have a question, we can move. We can. Yeah.
Sorry, forgive me, Chair. I thought you were asking if there were any further questions. Just a couple. What weight do emerging policies in a local plan carry in decision making on individual planning applications? And you mentioned 82 sites, proposed sites. Can you tell us how they're spread across Ealing, please?
So in terms of the weight or materiality, as we call it, that's determined really by three factors. Firstly, the stage of the preparation of the emerging plan. So the more advanced you are in the process, the more weight and materiality potentially can be given to an emerging policy. The extent to which there are any unresolved objections to relevant policies in the emerging plan. So, the less significant the unresolved objections, the greater weight you can give. And then the degree of consistency of policies in the emerging plan with the national planning policy framework. So if there's a high correlation, they should get great weight. So to try and illustrate that by example, we brought forward some quite controversial proposals, for example, on the threshold for fast tracking applications from 35% in the London plan as it currently is to 40%, because we wanted to viability test a broader range of schemes so we could see whether or not there was greater opportunity or scope to see more affordable housing being provided. That has been intensely controversial. You can imagine the pushback we've got from the development industry. So my advice to my colleagues in DM and on planning committee is you probably shouldn't seek to implement that policy rigorously. It wouldn't attract much materiality because that is still a contentious policy. On the other hand, even though this is also contentious in many ways, many of the site allocations include design guidance about where tall buildings should be appropriately located. That is a policy that is required by the London Plan, and we fulfil those requirements in the full, and the Mayor of London has said that is in general conformity with the plan. So we would tend to give that larger materiality in the decision-making process. Clearly, obviously, you don't give 100% materiality until the plan has been adopted. So we're still some way short of that, but obviously we are well down the road of examination. So assuming we are found sound, we can have a higher degree of confidence in some respects than others. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I'm afraid, but it depends. It's the executive answer.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So do we have recommendations following that discussion? A recommendation that I feel might be appropriate would be to align the local plan. It's currently a 5-year process, maybe to align it to the electoral cycle to ensure it's reflective of the priorities of an incoming administration, rather than allowing it to go out of kilter with the 5-year rotation. Keen for the for Ealing Council to work with the government to improve and lessen the burden of the inspection on the local plan process, and the same as Councillor Mamre was talking about, working with government to support developers to deliver the kind of properties through the kind of process that there is actual demand for in the borough. All of which I think we covered in the discussion. Are there any other Councillor Gillan?
That was mine, Chair. I mean, that's trying to work out how to actually put it into one sentence, but it's basically making the local plan responsive to the economic climate and to what the availability and to the market and the conditions. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Do we have any further suggestions for recommendations? No? Okay. In that case, I would like to thank Steve and Councillor Mamre very much for their time this evening. Very good of you to come. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to thank the panel members for their time this evening. And we've made our recommendations. And in that case, it just falls to me to say that the date of the next meeting is the 5th of February next year, which is very exciting. And otherwise, thank you very much for your time this evening and have a good evening.